The sharp sting of pepper spray filled the air, a burning mist cutting through the chaos of the street. Officer Reynolds stood firm, his face twisted in irritation as the figure before him refused to back down. He had dealt with plenty of disobedient troublemakers before. This was no different. But the low, guttural growl that followed made his stomach tighten. His grip on the spray can trembled slightly. The figure on all fours didn't blink, didn't cower. Its golden-brown fur was slick with sweat, muscles tensed, teeth bared. It wasn't a man, it was a dog, a canine. And Reynolds had just made the worst mistake of his career. The crowd around him fell silent, their shocked murmurs swallowed by the weight of what had just happened. Someone gasped. Another person took a cautious step back. The moment stretched unbearably, the sting of the spray still heavy in the air. Then, a voice cut through the tension, deep and cold. "You just pepper sprayed my dog." The officer turned, his mouth dry, his excuse forming before he even saw who had spoken. But when his eyes finally landed on the man, his breath caught in his throat. A pair of unflinching eyes met his, filled with something deadly. This wasn't just any handler, this was someone far worse. The kind of man whose reputation alone was enough to turn the bravest officers into cowards. Reynolds had made a mistake, and he knew with chilling certainty that there was no way to take it back. The air hung thick with tension, the scent of sweat and fear lingering beneath the glow of flickering streetlights. A warm breeze rolled through the quiet alley, but it did little to ease the suffocating atmosphere. The shadows stretched unnaturally long, twisting across the pavement like reaching fingers. The distant hum of the city seemed muted, swallowed by an eerie silence that felt unnatural. Every footstep echoed, too sharp, too loud, like something unseen was listening, waiting. The walls of the alley were damp with the residue of an earlier storm, and each drip from the rusted fire escape above sent a cold shiver down the spine. Officer Reynolds' breath came uneven, his pulse hammering against his throat. His training told him to stand his ground, to stay in control, but something about this moment felt different. Off. The golden-brown K9 lay motionless, its sides rising and falling in slow, shallow breaths, its muscles still tense as if anticipating an attack. The dog's handler remained unreadable, standing with his fists clenched at his sides. His gaze locked onto Reynolds with an intensity that made the officer's skin prickle. The distant wail of a siren cut through the silence, but it felt too far away, too removed from the weight of the moment. A street lamp buzzed overhead, flickering before plunging the alley into momentary darkness. When the light sputtered back to life, Reynolds felt his stomach knot. The handler hadn't moved, yet somehow he felt closer, like the very air between them had shifted. The silence deepened, thick with an unspoken threat. The wind picked up, carrying the faintest whisper of something cold, something unseen slithering through the night. Reynolds swallowed hard, a single realization settling deep into his bones. He wasn't in control anymore. Officer Daniel Reynolds had spent 12 years patrolling the streets, yet nothing in his career had prepared him for this moment. He had built a reputation as a hard-nosed enforcer of the law, a man who didn't hesitate, who didn't second-guess his actions. His colleagues admired his fearlessness, but few knew the truth. His confidence was a mask, a thin veneer hiding the anxiety that gnawed at him every time he stepped onto the streets. He had seen too much, done too much. The ghosts of past mistakes lingered in the corners of his mind, whispering doubts he refused to acknowledge. The dog, now sprawled on the cold pavement, triggered something deep inside him. It wasn't just guilt, it was fear. A memory surfaced, one he had buried long ago. He had been 10 when his father, a decorated officer, had forced him to put down their family dog after it had attacked a neighbor. The sharp crack of the gunshot, the way the light had faded from the dog's eyes, it had never left him. And now, standing here, staring at the unconscious K9, that same suffocating dread crept up his spine. The handler, a tall figure clad in black, remained unsettlingly silent. His stance was rigid, his face shadowed beneath the brim of his cap. Something about him felt unnatural. His presence was too still, too controlled, as if he wasn't just a man but something more. Reynolds could feel the weight of his gaze, a quiet judgment radiating from him. Who was he? Why wasn't he reacting? Most handlers would be screaming, furious, demanding justice. But this man simply stood there, watching. Reynolds felt his fingers twitch at his side. His instincts told him to move, to leave, to do something, anything, to break the unbearable tension. But before he could, the handler took a slow step forward. The air around them felt heavier, the shadows pressing in closer. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, the man spoke. "You don't know what you've done." His words weren't a threat, but a statement of fact. And for the first time in years, Officer Reynolds felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel. Pure, unshakable fear. Officer Reynolds stood frozen as the handler's words echoed in his mind. "You don't know what you've done." The weight of those words settled in his chest like a cold stone. He glanced down at the K9, its body unnervingly still, the rhythmic rise and fall of its breathing barely visible. The pepper spray shouldn't have done this, not to a trained police dog. It should have recovered by now. But it didn't, and something about that felt deeply, inexplicably wrong. The handler knelt beside the dog, his fingers brushing against its fur in a way that felt more reverent than concerned. His face remained unreadable, but there was something in his posture, something rigid and barely contained. When he finally looked up, his eyes locked onto Reynolds with an intensity that sent an involuntary shiver down his spine. "You should leave," the man said, his voice low and deliberate. "Now." Reynolds' instincts screamed at him to listen, to get in his cruiser and drive away. But his pride refused to let him back down. He squared his shoulders, clenching his fists as he forced his voice to remain steady. "I was doing my job," he said, though the words felt weak even to his own ears. "If you've got a problem, take it up with the department." The handler didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a badge. One Reynolds didn't recognize. It wasn't the standard police insignia, nor was it federal. The emblem, an intricate design of interwoven symbols, seemed to shift slightly under the dim streetlight. For the first time that night, a genuine sense of unease curled in Reynolds' gut. "You think this is about protocol?" the handler finally said, slipping the badge back into his pocket. "You think this is about jurisdiction?" His voice darkened. "That dog isn't just a K9 unit. And you didn't just spray it with pepper spray." Reynolds swallowed hard. The air around them felt different now, thicker, charged. A sudden gust of wind sent a nearby newspaper fluttering down the empty street, but the sound barely registered. He forced himself to scoff, trying to mask the creeping dread slithering up his spine. "Then what the hell did I spray it with?" The handler stood, his movements slow and deliberate. "Something that shouldn't exist in your world," he said. "Something that binds. Something that silences." Reynolds' heart pounded against his ribs. The handler wasn't making sense, but something in his gut told him not to dismiss him so easily. He took a cautious step back, glancing down at the K9 again. Its eyes were open now, but not in the way they should have been. They weren't dazed or irritated from the spray. They were pitch black, endless voids reflecting nothing but darkness. Reynolds' breath caught in his throat. "What the?" The dog moved, not in a natural, recovering from injury way, but in a way that sent pure, animalistic terror rushing through Reynolds' veins. Its limbs jerked as if they weren't its own, as if something was pulling invisible strings beneath its skin. And then, just as suddenly as it had gone still, it stood. The handler remained motionless, watching, waiting. Reynolds took another step back, his fingers brushing against the grip of his service weapon. "What the hell is wrong with that dog?" The handler exhaled, slow and measured. "It's not a dog anymore." Before Reynolds could process those words, the K9 moved. It didn't lunge, didn't snarl or growl. Instead, it took a single step forward, tilting its head in a way that was unnervingly human. The streetlights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched unnaturally toward him. A sharp, unbearable pressure built in his skull, like something was clawing at the edges of his mind. Voices, no whispers, filled his ears, an incomprehensible chorus of words he didn't understand yet somehow felt. His grip tightened around his gun, but before he could draw it, the handler finally spoke again. "Put that away," he said. "It won't help." Reynolds' jaw clenched. His survival instincts screamed for him to run, to get as far away as possible. But something held him in place. It wasn't fear, not entirely. It was something deeper, something primal. "You should have listened," the handler murmured. "You should have left." The K9 took another step forward, and the world around Reynolds shifted. The air itself seemed to vibrate, the cityscape around him warping at the edges, as if reality itself was fraying. And then, just as the pressure in his skull became unbearable, the dog blinked, and everything went black. Darkness swallowed everything. No streetlights, no sounds of the city, just silence, thick, absolute and suffocating. Officer Reynolds' breath came in shallow gasps, his pulse hammering in his ears like distant thunder. He blinked rapidly, trying to force his eyes to adjust, but there was nothing. No frame of reference, no sense of up or down, just an endless void. Then a noise, a soft, wet scrape. Close, too close. Reynolds turned sharply, reaching for his gun, only to find his holster empty. Panic flared in his chest. He tried to move, but his limbs felt heavy, sluggish, as if he were submerged in thick, invisible water. The scrape came again, this time from behind him. He spun instinctively, his breath hitching. The darkness shifted, taking shape, a silhouette barely distinguishable from the void around it. A whisper brushed against his ear, a voice that didn't belong to anyone he could see. "You shouldn't have stayed." His body jerked backward, muscles locking with primal terror. His eyes darted around, searching for the handler, for the K9, for anything. But he was alone, or so he thought. A flicker, just for a second, like something moving in the blackness. Then another, and another, shapes shifting just at the edge of his vision, too fast to track, too slow to ignore. His heart slammed against his ribs, the suffocating quiet making each beat sound deafening. Then suddenly light, a dim, flickering glow, like a dying fluorescent bulb sputtering to life. The world returned in broken fragments. A cracked sidewalk, a rusted street sign, his cruiser parked at the curb. A wave of relief surged through him. It was just a blackout, he told himself, inhaling deeply. Just a trick of the darkness. Then he saw the dog. It stood a few feet away, its body unnaturally still, head slightly tilted as if observing him. But something was wrong. The way it stood, the way its shadow stretched in the wrong direction, bending at unnatural angles. Its eyes, completely black, were locked onto him, unblinking. Reynolds' breath hitched. He took a cautious step back. The dog's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Instead, its jaw unhinged just a fraction too wide, revealing rows of teeth that weren't shaped right, too sharp, too long. The handler's words echoed in his head. "It's not a dog anymore." Reynolds swallowed hard, forcing logic into the chaos of his thoughts. It was just his mind playing tricks on him. The pepper spray, the stress, it was messing with his head. He needed to regain control. He took another step back, forcing his voice to remain steady. "Easy there, buddy. Just stay." The streetlights flickered violently, and in the fraction of a second the world went dark. The dog moved. Not in a normal way. It was standing 10 feet away one moment, and in the next it was inches from him. No sound, no motion, just there. Reynolds stumbled back with a sharp inhale, his legs nearly giving out beneath him. His hand went instinctively for his gun again, but it still wasn't there. The realization sent another surge of terror through his veins. The air turned thick, heavy, pressing down on his chest. A low, guttural growl rumbled from the K9's throat, not like a normal dog, but like something pretending to be one. The sound crawled under his skin, setting every nerve on edge. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the dog sat down, perfectly still, watching. Reynolds exhaled shakily, his mind scrambling for an explanation. Maybe this was it. Maybe it was over. Maybe whatever hallucination had gripped him was fading. He forced himself to take another breath, to ground himself. It was fine. He was fine. Then the whisper returned. "Look behind you." Ice shot through his veins. He didn't want to turn. Every instinct screamed at him not to, but he had to. He had to prove to himself that there was nothing there. Slowly, stiffly, he turned his head. Something was standing behind him. Tall. Wrong. Shadowy limbs too thin, stretching out as if reaching for him. No face. Just hollow, endless black where features should be. And it was smiling. Reynolds' body locked, his lungs refusing to take in air. The thing leaned forward, its two long fingers twitching. The void where its eyes should have been locked onto his. Then darkness again. Only this time it wasn't empty. It was full. The darkness was suffocating, pressing against Reynolds like a living thing. His breath came in ragged gasps, his pulse hammering so loudly in his ears that it drowned out everything else. He tried to move, but his limbs felt heavy, paralyzed by an unseen force. The whispering grew louder, overlapping voices crawling under his skin like a swarm of unseen insects. Then the lights flickered again, just for a moment, just long enough for him to see it. The dog was gone. In its place stood something else, tall, unnatural, its body shifting like smoke yet solid enough to cast a twisted shadow against the pavement. Its face, or what should have been its face, was featureless, save for the gaping, jagged grin that seemed to stretch far beyond the boundaries of a human mouth. Reynolds' instincts screamed at him to run, but his body refused to obey. The figure took a step forward, its elongated fingers twitching as if eager to grasp something. He tried to force himself to move, to break free of whatever invisible grip held him frozen. He clenched his jaw, digging his nails into his palms until pain shot through his nerves, grounding him for just a fraction of a second. And that was enough. With a sudden jolt, his legs obeyed, and he staggered backward, his heart slamming against his ribs. His foot caught on a crack in the pavement, and he hit the ground hard, pain jolting up his spine. But he didn't stop. He scrambled back on his hands, his breath coming in sharp, frantic bursts. The thing moved again, faster this time. One moment it was standing a few feet away, and the next it was inches from him, towering over him like a shadow given form. The whispering voices grew deafening, overlapping until they became a single distorted scream. Then silence. The world froze. The thing cocked its head, almost curiously, its faceless void locked onto him. Then, slowly, its long fingers lifted, reaching toward his face. Reynolds' breath caught in his throat. He had no weapon, no backup, no way out. But then, a gunshot. The deafening crack split the silence, and the shadowed figure recoiled, its form flickering like a broken projection. Another shot rang out, and the whispering screams returned, this time laced with something else. Anger. Pain. Reynolds barely registered the voice shouting his name. He turned his head, his vision swimming. Someone was running toward him, his partner, Harris. "Get up!" Harris shouted, firing another round at the thing. The bullets didn't seem to hit anything solid, but each shot made the figure flicker, as if disrupting whatever unnatural force held it together. Reynolds forced his shaking limbs to obey, scrambling to his feet as Harris grabbed his arm and dragged him back toward the cruiser. The creature let out a shriek, a sound so inhuman that it made Reynolds' skull feel like it was vibrating from the inside. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it collapsed. The darkness around it seemed to fold in on itself, imploding into a void of nothingness. For a single, breathless second, everything was still. Then the streetlights hummed back to life. The air felt lighter. The weight that had pressed against Reynolds' chest vanished. The world was normal again, except for the dog. The K9 lay motionless on the ground where the creature had been. Reynolds' stomach twisted. He knew deep down that it wouldn't move again, that whatever had happened to it, whatever had taken its place, had burned out along with the entity. Harris was panting, his gun still raised. What the hell was that? Reynolds didn't answer. He couldn't. Because even as the world settled back into normalcy, something inside him whispered that it wasn't over. The The thing was gone, but the shadow it left behind? That would never fade. Reynolds sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The street outside looked the same, quiet, empty, untouched by the horrors of the night. But he knew better. He felt it. The air still carried a weight, an echo of something unnatural, something that didn't belong. His mind replayed the events over and over. The way the shadows twisted, the sound of the whispering voices, the unnatural grin stretching beyond the limits of human anatomy. And then the dog. The K-9 officer who had trusted him, who had been caught in something beyond understanding. He had seen death before, but this was different. This wasn't just death. It was erasure. Harris had tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a trick of the light, he had said. Maybe stress, exhaustion. Maybe we imagined it. But Reynolds could hear the uncertainty in his voice. They had both seen it, felt it. The truth was, there were no answers. But the questions, they remained. Was the creature truly gone? Or had it just moved? Slipped back into the darkness, waiting? A shiver ran down his spine. He started the engine, trying to shake the feeling that something was watching. That the whispering might return. That the thing in the shadows hadn't come for the dog at all. Maybe, just maybe, it was coming back for him. What do you think really happened that night? Was it just a trick of the mind? Or was something far more sinister at play? And most importantly, do you think the horror is truly over? Or is it just waiting for its next victim? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Would you have stayed and investigated? Or would you have run the moment things felt off? Your answer might just reveal what kind of survivor you'd be in a real nightmare. If this story sent chills down your spine, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more terrifying tales that will keep you up at night. And don't forget to turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Because in the world of horror, the scariest stories are the ones that might just be true,